Thank you. Hi. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk mostly, well, pretty much specifically about the Mexico 68 program and the typography. A little bit about me first. I'm kind of a New Jersey, New York boy. I was born in Newark, grew up over in Kearny. I've lived in Manhattan since, my family and I lived there since 1971, so I guess I qualify as a New Yorker now. And I went to school in Brooklyn. Now, let's see. There we go. My office and our home is up on West 80th Street, and it's a townhouse, and the bay window is the office window. My website is a spiral, and it's actually a chronological spiral, so all of the early work is in the beginning, and this part of the spiral goes up as far as the Olympic program, and I've done quite a bit of work since then. But I'm going to specifically talk about the Olympic program. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about, I went to Pratt, I mentioned that. I studied industrial design. I didn't really get much training in any kind of art or design in high school, but when I was a kid, my grandfather was a Spanish-American war veteran, and after the war, he went out to New Mexico. And he was actually out there when Billy the Kid was there. He met Pat Garrett, the guy that shot Billy the Kid. So I got a lot of stories from him. And when I met him, he was just retiring as an engineer on the Lackawanna Railroad. And as a little kid, I really got a lot of these stories. So I think the storytelling, that if any part of my work has anything to do with storytelling, I think my grandfather's really responsible for that. So I got a lot of stories from him, and I didn't know what graphic design was then, so of course I wanted to be like him. I wanted to be a cowboy. This was my first poster. I ran for class president in Kearny High School, and I don't know how much this poster helped me, but I won. And I'll jump ahead a little bit here because I've gotten better at doing posters. I did one of the Obama official posters. I mentioned I went to Pratt. After Pratt, I went to a student program, actually. I was selected to represent the industrial design school at a program at the New Tech Center in Warren, Michigan. And this is the Saarinen New Tech Center at that point. And then I was hired back at General Motors after I graduated from Pratt. And I met a graphic designer. Well, let me mention at that point, they didn't teach graphic design except at the graduate school. So I met a Yale student in that summer program and really got into, I didn't even know it existed, but I fell in love with graphic design. And I actually got hired back at General Motors, and I designed the Delco parts symbol and the packaging program. The packaging program was really my first big job, and it was 1,200 different packages that had to be accommodated by the design. So now this is an instance where my industrial design background really got me into understanding systems. I did my military. I was in the infantry, and I was a fire direction center coordinator, so I was on maps all the time. I didn't have any idea that I'd have anything of value coming out of this, but I did learn a lot about maps, and I have done maps. When I got back into designing again, my first job, I was still working at an office in Detroit, Michigan, and I had a chance to do the graphics for a show. Actually, it was a trade show by the Department of Commerce in Zagreb, Yugoslavia. I had never been out of New York or Detroit, or, at that point I hadn't been too many places. So I went to Zagreb, and it really opened my eyes to see that they were still behind the curtain, and they could do so much creatively with so little. It was a big lesson. Now, I'll show a little bit of this because it was the first time that I really got into spatial graphics. The theme of the show was constructive use of leisure time. So I used an hourglass and a sun moon for daytime, nighttime activity, and suggested that we build it big, and we did, and also made the fence for the exhibit. So this was really the first spatial graphics that I got into, and that was very early in my career. I came back to New York after that, and I worked with George Nelson. Now, George had one of the best offices in the world at that point, and it was a real pleasure working with him. The job that I worked on was the Chrysler World's Fair, and as you can see, it was the pavilion itself was actually 5 buildings, and they had an artificial lake. I developed a pointing hand that the kids could wear. It was for children, and that was very effective because it told the kid that he was very important, and then these little hands got all over the fair site, so it was a good deal for Chrysler. And it was interesting for me because I used that same hand as a an information device, a wayfinding system, if you will. So I got into wayfinding early on also. After that, I had done more work with George. I did work that traveled to Russia, to Moscow and other points in Russia on industrial design in this country and so forth. But I want to get to the Olympics now. And at this point, one of the architects from the Mexican Pavilion at the World's Fair in 1950, I think it was 54, 55, Eduardo Terrazas, after the fair was over, he came over to the Nelson office and stayed in New York, and I worked with him. And it was during that period that I found out that they were having the Olympics in Mexico, and Eduardo got a call from Mexico, and it was Ramirez Vasquez, the guy who was the architect for the Mexican Pavilion at the World's Fair. He went back to Mexico and designed the Museum of Anthropology. And he was calling Eduardo saying, come back, I want you to work with me again. So Eduardo, off the cuff, said, I don't know what we're going to do about graphics. We don't really, teach except at one school, graphic design in Mexico. So I was working with Peter Murdoch. I had met Peter over at the Royal College. I went over on vacation from the Nelson office, and one of the guys in the office had a brother at the Royal College. So I went over to see the Royal College, and I met Peter Murdoch. So Peter came to New York after that. He got a scholarship to do anything he wanted for a year. And because I was working with George Nelson, and George was very famous with Herman Miller Furniture, Peter came back, and we realized we worked very well together, and we actually were going to open an office. But I had asked Eduardo what he was going to do, and he said, we're going to have a competition. We're going to invite individual designers for a 2-week period, and if nothing happens, they go home. And then we're going to have all the major offices in the world submit proposals to do the graphics for the Olympics. So Peter and we got on that list. Now, I had just gotten married, I think it was about 3 months before our schedule was to go down to Mexico, and we didn't really have enough money to pay for tickets. We had one account in Boston. Peter went up to Boston and cashed a check. You couldn't wire money so easily then. Bought our tickets. We had reservations, and we couldn't afford to pay them. So the day before, he got the tickets, and we flew to Mexico. But we had one-way tickets. And here we are. That's Peter on the right, Neela, who's here tonight, my wife of 52 years now, and me. And that was our very, very first day. This is in Alameda Park in Mexico City. Now, this is the cast of characters that were the very, very beginnings of the Olympic program. That's Terrazas on the left, Ramirez Vasquez, the chairman of the Olympic Committee. That's Matthias Gerritz. He did the root of friendship. And that's Peter, and that's me. And we were down there, we went down November 1966. So this is celebrating Christmas in our office with the Christmas balls hanging from the ceiling. We didn't have much of a guideline to work with. Ramirez Vasquez said he did not want this image. He wanted not Mexico looking like one of the typical images of a guy sleeping under a cactus with his sombrero down. We did have to work with 3 languages. In Mexico, it was Spanish, French, and English. And we had to work with the 5 rings that I showed you earlier, the 5 Olympic rings. And now, at that point, MoMA here had the op art show, so I was full of that. I just loved that show. It was, Bridget Riley was one of my favorites out of it, but it was really getting a lot of energy and a lot of movement and so forth from the flat surface. It was really powerful. So I had that in my mind when I went down, or at least in my experience. I didn't really know, none of us really knew a lot about Mexico. I knew they had piñatas. Peter and I spent, I think the first week of those 2 weeks we spent over at the Museum of Anthropology, and I absolutely fell in love with the early cultures there in Mexico, from Olmec up through Aztec. I mean, those designers or artists, whatever you want to call them, they really knew how to work with geometry. They knew how to express all the things that they lived with, you know, their mythologies, the nature, the people, geometry itself. They were powerful. And then, of course, that still goes on in Mexico. You have the artisanía, or the folk art, and this was done actually by the Huichol Indians. And I was down with my, my technical equipment came with me. We didn't have any computers, of course, then. This is 1966. I still have these guys. And it was at the end of the first week when I discovered that those 5 rings could be worked with as part of an image that could generate the year of the event, the 68. And actually, that's the first compass sketch, I call it, where I really got serious about trying to make this work with the geometry of the 5 rings. And there it is refined. Now, as far as the typography is concerned with this, the letter forms come from the 68. And that was pretty obvious. But the thing that wasn't obvious, when I developed the typography, I didn't like the way it worked with the 68, because when it came together, it looked like something different. It didn't look like the 68. And then I realized the whole thing had to be smushed together, I call it. It's you know, a matter of overlapping. And then it was a matter of how many strokes do you overlap. Like the I, obviously, 1 stroke. The XI, hardly a stroke, and so forth. So it became a design project in itself. And when you see it here, none of the overlaps have been cleared out. And there it is, and that was the magic. Boy, once I did that and I saw what it looked like, it really had a powerful reference, literally saying Mexico 68, the place of the games, the year of the event, and the event itself with the rings. But it also had that look that looked very, very, very Mexican. And of course, then my influence from the op art show stepped in. One of the first successes, it was in a poster exhibit at MoMA. I used it in many, many things, stamps, posters. It was the official poster. That's me. Now you can see here, if you look closely at that, you can see that painting that on a wall as a wall mural was not easy. I mean, they had to pencil it in, then fill it in. And I worked with Peter's wife, Julia, and we did a lot of uniform designs. You didn't need the typography. You knew it was part of the program. 3-dimensional. This was the beginning of putting the Mexico 68 at the entrance to the Olympic Stadium. This is the opening of the games. You can see that they didn't have safety in mind. This is up on the edge of the stadium. But as the games progressed at the end of the games, they had safety in mind. This is just the beginning of the closing ceremony when they started coming into the stadium. So you can see the difference there. I worked very closely with Terraces, and we developed the pavilion for the Triennale in Milan. And here you can see the entrance, and you can see what it looks like as you entered the exhibit. We did a lot of exploration with different things, large balloons. We actually had Huichol Indians come to the Museum of Anthropology, and what I did, I gave them a board and silk screened on the board, and what they would do, and the way they built up their imagery, they cover the board with wax, then they push strands of wool into it, which again, I mean, the wool itself is excuse me, lines. So we let them do what they wanted, and this was really interesting to see what they did with their color, because they worked so beautifully with color. And of course, color was a big part of our program. The nice thing about the graphic is that you didn't have to do anything to the graphic except change the color, and you had a whole system of color that really looked Mexican also. And this was really important for our publications. And of course, no computers, so any color studies we made were all done by hand. These are some of the publications that we did. You can see that we let that work. Thank God for the parallel lines. It worked with everything. Everything I radiated out, and I took a lot of different subject matters and made them look like they're part of the Olympics. Radiating out from the stadiums was beautiful for coming in by air, because you could actually see that the Olympics were going on. Here's where the typography becomes extremely useful as a branding system. I pushed this was a lot of work because all the different installations, we used the typography to call them out, the arena, the auditorio, and so on. Now, I'll just go through some other elements because obviously it wasn't just typography that was the branding system. The Greeks used silhouettes. I use silhouettes as a stamp design, running one stamp into itself and creating a sense of activity with the stamps. The stamps themselves became an important part of the branding program. They became a very important part of the wayfinding system. You can see here, they gave you all the information you needed. We had to use 3 languages. We tried to use no languages whenever we possibly could. So on the signs and the tickets, we used the icons for the sporting events. Peter and I did the signs. There's no language there. We use only the proper names, Mexico 68 Estadio, October. No language except numbers, symbol. And then if you were in the blue section, the blue symbol gave you the entrance, and then you went to your seat. The tickets, when you put them all together, were very colorful too. So color was a big part of the Olympics. We had not only the sports program, we had a cultural program, and here you see the typography on the side. I tried to keep everything over flush to the edge so that the illustrators and the designers that were doing the posters had full range of the sheet. This is a David Palladini poster. David did the tarot cards when he came back to New York. I think the Gypsies are still using them here, but he was a wonderful illustrator. One of the symbols, now this was a part in Mexico that was not difficult. I mean, it was difficult. It was the student uprising, and up here in the States, Dr. King was assassinated. Mexico did the first stamp in honor of Dr. King, and they asked me to design it. So actually, I did the first postage stamp design for Dr. King, and I used the symbol for peace that we had developed for our cultural program. Now, in Mexico, the student uprising was going on, and they were using my symbols also, but they were using them out in the street as demonstrations against the Mexican government. So there was a lot of history in '68, and a lot of it I was in touch with personally. And back about 2 years now, they asked me to do the memorial to Tlatelolco. Now at Tlatelolco, there were a lot of students killed when they quelched the student uprising. So I transformed the dove into a phoenix, and the logo is Memorial 68. He's the director of the memorial. Now, just to finish up, I want to show you what we're doing now. One thing that I realized that these 2 programs I did that really have hung in there, the imagery from the Mexico 68 Olympics, and I did the metro, the subway down there, and I did, well, I'll show you a little bit of that. This is MX. We developed this to be part of a city planning program. If you look at this, you see the 3 lines of the structure of the typography. We pushed that into being an extruded element for structuring bus stops. This is being constructed right at the moment now in Mexico City, and they run right through the center of the city down Reforma. The signs are pretty much based on, here you can see some of the ones that are finished now. And I use the same system. This is the metro, and we're using the same iconic system to identify all the stations. The B is for the bus line. And this is about 2 weeks old now. They asked me to do the cover of Washington Post section on 1968, and I don't know. This keeps coming up now. It's 50 years old since this program happened, but this was like 2 weeks old. That's it. So I'm still doing it. Thank you.